It was the eve of Thanksgiving. November 24, 1971. Portland Airport, in the state of Oregon, was packed with families traveling for the holiday. Luggage, children, the smell of cheap coffee and the constant noise of announcements over the speakers. A man walked up to the Northwest Orient Airlines counter and bought a last-minute ticket to Seattle. He paid cash. $20. Destination, Seattle, Washington. Flight 305. The man sat down in seat 17E, at the rear of the aircraft. He ordered a bourbon and soda. He lit a cigarette. And he waited. There was nothing about him that drew attention. A middle-aged man. Black suit. White shirt. Black tie with a mother-of-pearl tie clip. Dark hair. Dark sunglasses. A calm face. When flight attendant Florence Schaffner passed through the aisle, the man handed her a folded note. Florence assumed it was a phone number from yet another passenger trying to be friendly. Without looking, she slipped the note into her purse. The man leaned slightly toward her and said, in a low voice, "Miss, you should read that note. I have a bomb." Florence opened the paper. She read it. And the world of American aviation was never the same again. What was written in that note was not fully disclosed until decades later. But the essence was direct. The man claimed to have a bomb in his briefcase. He demanded $200,000 in unmarked $20 bills. 4 parachutes. 2 primary and 2 reserve. And a plane to take him wherever he wanted to go. Florence went to the cockpit and informed Captain William Scott. Captain Scott did not panic. With 30 years of experience, he knew what to do. He kept calm, kept the flight going, and radioed air traffic control in Seattle. The FBI was notified immediately. As the plane approached Seattle, negotiations began over the radio. The man remained seated. He drank his bourbon. He smoked. Flight attendant Tina Mucklow was assigned to communicate with him directly. In her later statements, she would describe the hijacker as surprisingly calm. Polite, even. There was no anger. No visible nervousness. It was as if he had done this before. Or as if he had planned every detail long in advance. The plane landed in Seattle. The passengers were released. The money and the parachutes were delivered. $200,000 in $20 bills. The serial numbers, all photographed by the FBI before delivery. And then the man gave his final instructions. The plane would take off again. It would fly toward Mexico. At an altitude of no more than 10,000 feet. With the landing gear down. At a speed not exceeding 150 knots. Captain Scott explained that a Boeing 727 could not fly that slowly with the gear down for that long without refueling. They would need to stop in Reno, Nevada. The man agreed. The plane took off from Seattle at 7:40 in the evening. And at some point between Seattle and Reno, the man opened the rear staircase of the aircraft. And jumped into the darkness. To understand why that jump was possible, we need to talk about a technical detail that made the D.B. Cooper case unique in the history of aviation. The Boeing 727 was, at the time, the only commercial aircraft in the world with a rear staircase that could be opened during flight. The stairs were located at the bottom of the tail, accessible from inside the aircraft. It was a design feature that engineers never imagined anyone would use in that way. At 8:13 in the evening on November 24, the indicators in the cockpit showed that the rear staircase had been activated. Captain Scott asked over the intercom if everything was all right at the rear. No one answered. A few minutes later, the sensors showed that the pressure in the tail section had changed. The man had jumped. Under conditions that, for any survival expert, were close to impossible. The temperature outside was -7 degrees Celsius. With the wind chill from the aircraft's speed, the effective temperature was -45 degrees. It was dark. Raining. The terrain below was dense forest in the American Northwest, with no visible lights anywhere. The man was wearing a suit. Leather shoes. No gloves. No helmet. No thermal clothing. And he had chosen, from among the 4 parachutes delivered to him, a civilian sport parachute, sewn in an unconventional manner. One of the reserve parachutes that had been sent was actually a training parachute, sewn shut and sealed with no opening. Useless in an emergency. Either he did not know that. Or he did, and calculated that he would not need a reserve. The plane landed in Reno. Police and FBI agents immediately stormed the aircraft. Seat 17E was empty. There were 8 cigarette butts in the ashtray. And on the black tie the man had removed and left on the seat, investigators would find years later particles of a very specific material, pure titanium, mixed with stainless steel and aluminum. A material used in very few industries in the early 1970s. A clue that would take decades to interpret. The name D.B. Cooper was not the hijacker's real name. When he bought his ticket, he used the name Dan Cooper. Simple. No elaborate surname. Dan Cooper. But in the hours following the hijacking, the Associated Press made an error. In Portland, police had briefly questioned a man named D.B. Cooper, who had no connection to the case and was quickly cleared. By confusion, the name D.B. Cooper was attached to the hijacker in news broadcasts. And the name stuck. Forever. No criminal in American history became so famous under a name that was not his. The FBI investigation was codenamed Norjack, short for Northwest Hijacking. And it became the longest-running investigation in Bureau history, 45 years of active investigation, more than 1,000 suspects investigated, more than 60,000 pages of documents accumulated. What investigators had to work with was limited but intriguing. The physical description from witnesses pointed to a man between 40 and 45 years of age. Approximately 5 feet 10 to 6 feet tall. Dark hair, possibly dyed. Slightly olive complexion, dark eyes. In good physical shape. He spoke calmly and clearly. He used correct aeronautical terminology, such as pressurization and wing deflection, in a natural way. He knew about the Boeing 727. He knew that the rear staircase could be opened during flight. He did not seem nervous. He did not seem like an amateur. And when he demanded 4 parachutes instead of 2, the negotiators realized he was signaling that he might take hostages with him. A smart tactic to prevent the parachutes from being sabotaged. Because if there was a possibility that a hostage would also jump, no one would risk delivering a defective parachute. This was a man who thought ahead. Who understood negotiation psychology. And who, apparently, understood aviation. In February of 1980, 8 years and 3 months after the jump, an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram went with his family for a picnic along the banks of the Columbia River, at a sandbar called Tenna Bar, about 19 miles northwest of Vancouver, in the state of Washington. While playing, Brian began digging in the damp sand with his hands. And he found 3 bundles of banknotes. Deteriorated, faded, partially decomposed by moisture. But still legible. When investigators arrived and checked the serial numbers, confirmation came immediately. They were notes from the D.B. Cooper ransom. $5,800. Exactly the money corresponding to 289 $20 bills with the serial numbers registered by the FBI. The rest, $194,200, was never found. The discovery at Tenna Bar created more questions than answers. Because Tenna Bar sits on the Columbia River. And the Columbia River was not on the flight path of the aircraft. The hijacker would have jumped further north, over the forests of the state of Washington. How did the money get to the Columbia? Theory 1. The money was carried by the current from some tributary of the Columbia over 8 years. Theory 2. Cooper survived the jump, walked through the forest, and at some point crossed the Columbia, losing part of the money in the process. Theory 3. The money was placed there by someone. None of these theories was ever proven. And the location of the notes in the ground was inconsistent with natural river deposition. The notes were in bundles, grouped together, as if they had been buried there, and not carried by water. Which means someone may have been on that sandbar with Cooper's money. Alive or dead. Over 45 years of investigation, the FBI analyzed more than 1,000 suspects. Most were quickly dismissed. But some left marks on the investigation that withstood the test of time. The first major suspect was Richard McCoy Jr. In April of 1972, just 5 months after Cooper's jump, McCoy hijacked a United Airlines flight in Salt Lake City, Utah. He demanded $500,000 and 4 parachutes. He jumped over the Utah desert. He was captured 2 days later. The similarities to the Cooper case were so striking that the FBI intensely investigated whether McCoy and Cooper were the same person. McCoy was an ex-Army paratrooper. He had served in Vietnam. He had experience with night jumps. He knew aviation. But witnesses from Cooper's flight and those from McCoy's hijacking described physically different individuals. McCoy was younger, taller. And there was concrete evidence that McCoy was elsewhere on the night of November 24, 1971. McCoy was convicted. He escaped from prison in 1974. And he died in a confrontation with FBI agents weeks later. The second high-profile suspect was Kenneth Christensen. In 2007, Christensen's brother Lyle presented to the FBI and journalist Jeffrey Gray evidence pointing to Kenneth as Cooper. Kenneth had worked as a purser for Northwest Airlines. He was intimately familiar with the Boeing 727. He was an amateur parachutist. And in the weeks following the hijacking, he had made an unusual cash purchase, a house. On his deathbed, Kenneth had told his brother that there was something he needed to say, but that he had never been able to fully reveal it. The FBI investigated. It dismissed Christensen based on differences in the physical description. But defenders of the Christensen theory argue that witnesses may have been mistaken on details. The third notable suspect was Dwayne Weber. In 1995, on his deathbed in a Florida hospital, Dwayne Weber held the hand of his wife, Jo Weber, and said the following words. Joe. I am Dan Cooper. Joe Weber spent the following years investigating her husband's past. She found several inconsistencies. A plane ticket to Seattle in November 1971. A knee damaged in a manner consistent with a badly executed parachute jump. And once, during a walk along the banks of the Columbia River, she said that Dwayne stopped, stared at the water for a long time, and murmured quietly, "I left part of the money here." The FBI investigated Weber. It found no evidence sufficient for a definitive conclusion. In 2016, a group of private investigators led by Detective Thomas Colbert presented to the FBI what they called definitive proof, coded messages embedded in letters sent by a former military man named Robert Rackstraw. Rackstraw was an ex-Army paratrooper, former pilot, convicted of fraud and other crimes. He had been investigated by the FBI in the 1970s and dismissed. The researchers claimed to have deciphered in Rackstraw's documents a code containing direct references to Cooper's jump. Rackstraw never confirmed or denied. The FBI did not reopen the case. In July of 2016, the FBI made an announcement that frustrated investigators, journalists, and enthusiasts around the world. The Norjack investigation was being suspended. Not closed. Suspended. An important technical distinction: the case could be reactivated if concrete new evidence emerged. The Bureau's justification was direct: after 45 years, the human resources dedicated exclusively to the Cooper case were better used in active investigations with victims who needed justice. Special Agent Larry Carr, who had worked on the case for years, was honest in an interview: "We will probably never know who he was. But that does not mean he got away with it. The conditions of that jump were so extreme that the chances of survival were minimal. It is more likely that his remains are somewhere in the forests of the state of Washington, and that we simply never found them." But here is the problem with that theory. If Cooper died in the jump, the money should have been with him. Or near him. Not 19 miles away on a sandbar along a different river. The presence of part of the money at Tena Bar remains the most disturbing fact of the case. And what investigators never managed to explain in a satisfactory way. 55 years after the jump, the mystery of D.B. Cooper remains intact. But in recent years, new scientific approaches have brought details that the original investigation did not have the resources to develop. The analysis of the titanium particles found on Cooper's tie was deepened by scientists at the University of Portland in 2016. The titanium found had a specific purity and composition that researchers associated with manufacturing processes used at only a handful of American companies in the early 1970s. Companies connected to the aerospace and defense industry. Which reinforces the theory that Cooper had a technical and specialized professional background. He was not just any adventurer. He was someone who had worked with advanced materials. Who understood aviation from the inside. Who had planned the hijacking with methodical precision. Another detail raised by independent researchers in recent years: the choice of flight. Cooper did not choose an international flight, where security was higher. He chose a short domestic flight. He specifically chose the Boeing 727, the only aircraft with a rear staircase operable during flight. He chose a nighttime departure, in bad weather, over dense forest. And he chose a destination that allowed the flight path over a specific area of the state of Washington. Every choice was deliberate. Every detail was calculated. This is not the behavior of someone who acted on impulse or desperation. It is the behavior of someone who had been planning this moment, perhaps for years. There is a cultural dimension to the D.B. Cooper case that cannot be ignored. In the days following the hijacking, as the FBI conducted its investigation, something unexpected happened in American public opinion. People started rooting for Cooper. The United States of 1971 was an exhausted country. The Vietnam War was still consuming American lives. The Watergate scandal was about to erupt. Trust in institutions was collapsing. And then this man appeared, who had outsmarted the FBI, outsmarted an airline, outsmarted the entire security apparatus of the state, and disappeared with $200,000 into the darkness of the night. Without hurting anyone. Without firing a single shot. For many Americans of that era, D.B. Cooper was not a criminal. He was a rebel. A ghost. A kind of solitary Robin Hood who had played a trick on the system and walked away unscathed. Books were written. Films were made. Songs were recorded. Annual festivals in his honor were held for decades in the town of Ariel, in the state of Washington, near the jump area. A criminal who was never identified, became an American folk hero. That cultural dimension says something important about the case. It is not just a criminal investigation. It is a mirror of a specific moment in American history. And of the universal human need to believe that someone, somewhere, managed to escape completely. What do we know for certain about D.B. Cooper? We know that on November 24, 1971, a man using the name Dan Cooper hijacked Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305. We know that he received $200,000 in $20 bills and 4 parachutes. We know that he jumped from the aircraft at some point between Seattle and Reno, probably over Clark or Cowlitz County in the state of Washington. We know that $5,800 of the ransom notes were found at Tena Bar in February 1980. We know that the rest of the money was never found. We know that his body was never found. We know that no suspect has been formally charged in 55 years of investigation. What we do not know is who he was. What we do not know is whether he survived the jump. What we do not know is what happened in the hours and days after the jump. And what we do not know, is whether he is dead or alive somewhere, old and anonymous, perhaps smiling to himself every time he sees his own name in a headline. Somewhere in the American Northwest, perhaps in the dense forests of the state of Washington, perhaps on a sandbar along the banks of the Columbia, perhaps in a farmhouse in some state no one would ever suspect. Is the answer $200,000 in $20 bills with registered serial numbers? Or what remains of them after 55 years? And perhaps the bones of a man who planned the perfect crime. Or perhaps, no bones at all. Because perhaps he pulled it off. Perhaps Dan Cooper opened that rear staircase at 10,000 feet, with the freezing wind of the American Northwest cutting through the November night, with $200,000 strapped to his body. And simply vanished. Forever. In 55 years of searching, with the FBI, military forces, private investigators, satellite technology, DNA analysis, and hundreds of volunteers combing through forests, no one found Dan Cooper. And that fact, whether it is a tragedy or a triumph, is the greatest mystery in American aviation. And it remains unsolved.